You're a servant, not a noble, not a soldier, just a quiet pair of hands in a royal palace that has too many corridors and too few gods. You've been summoned in the dead of night, again. The king couldn't sleep, he never sleeps. And now you're standing still as stone in the corner of his chamber, pretending not to breathe too loud. The air stinks of sweat and lavender oil. A dozen candles flicker along the walls, their flames twitching like they're nervous too. He's on the floor, not in his bed, not on his throne, on the marble, crouched like an animal. You watch him through the mirror. He hasn't noticed you. He's muttering something under his breath, a language you don't understand. Maybe it's not a language at all, just fragments of thoughts that no longer know how to form. His fingernails are bleeding. You see him reach up with trembling hands and tear a strand of hair from his own scalp. He chews it slowly, methodically, as if it's a sacrament, then another, long strands sticking to his lips, the ends matted with blood and spit. You know you're not supposed to watch, but you can't look away. He stares into the mirror. His eyes are wide and glassy, pupils too large, like they're swallowing the rest of him. For a moment he smiles, lips split and red, and says, almost gently, "He won't come back tonight." No one answers him. There's no one else in the room. You don't ask who he means. He drags his nails down his neck, drawing a thin red line. Then he starts laughing. It's soft at first, almost childlike. Then it builds, louder, unhinged, echoing through the golden chamber like a hymn from hell. You want to run, but you've been trained not to move unless ordered. This is Christian VII, King of Denmark and Norway, ruler of a mighty kingdom. A boy who became a monarch who became a ghost who became a mirror. And this is what remains, a body that feeds on itself, a crown that rests on a mind already gone. But he wasn't always like this. There was a time not long ago when this king was a boy with clear eyes and a nervous smile. A boy who could have been anything, until the palace walls began to rot from the inside, until power met madness, until silence became tradition. You didn't see that part, but it's where this story really begins. Before the laughter, before the mirrors, before the taste of hair on his tongue, Christian was just a boy born in a palace that smelled of wine and varnish, where golden tapestries muffled the sound of violence and cold corridors stretched longer than any childhood should. He was the only surviving son of King Frederick V, and from the moment of his first breath, he was a vessel, not a child, not a person, a body destined to wear a crown, nothing more. His mother died when he was barely old enough to speak her name. Some say she went mad before the end. Others say she was simply too fragile for the weight of royal life. Either way, she vanished quietly, and no one explained why her scent lingered in the curtains for months. His father, Frederick, was a different kind of ghost, a drunk, a tyrant with a smile. He preferred his mistresses to his ministers, his liquor cabinet to his heir. Christian would sometimes be summoned to the king's chambers, just to be reminded how disappointed the man was in the softness of his voice, in the tremble of his hands. And when the king wasn't watching, the tutors were. They weren't there to educate, they were there to break. Discipline meant isolation, silence, the rod. Christian learned to flinch before the first blow landed. He learned that tears only made the beatings worse, that kindness was something whispered behind closed doors, never spoken aloud. By 10, he'd begun twitching, small, repetitive movements he couldn't control. He blinked too often. He cleared his throat when he wasn't speaking. When they asked him why, he said he didn't know. They told him to stop. He tried. He couldn't. The doctors came next. They called it nervous disorder. They bled him, purged him, leeched him. They prescribed silence and prayer. But the thoughts didn't slow. They just grew teeth. By 12, Christian had learned the rules of survival. Smile when watched, nod when spoken to. Never trust a closed door. And above all, do not ask questions. Questions meant doubt. Doubt meant danger. He began speaking to himself, but only when no one else could hear. He whispered to walls, to books, to his reflection. He didn't yet understand what he was doing, but it made the fear quieter. When his father died, the court whispered that Christian wept not for loss, but for fear, because now the crown would sit on his head, and no one, not even Christian himself, believed he was ready. At 17, they dressed him in royal robes and handed him the scepter. Trumpets blared, the people cheered, paintings were commissioned to capture his boyish smile, his youthful grace. But those who stood close enough, those who had seen him in the early hours, chewing at his cuticles, blinking at shadows, knew something was already wrong. They just didn't know how wrong, not yet. Because coronations are made of music and masks, and the madness of kings doesn't begin with screaming. It begins with silence, slow, invisible, and patient. And Christian's madness was already watching from the mirror. The crown didn't weigh much, not physically. Gold, yes, but thin, delicate. Fit for a boy king whose hands trembled as they placed it on his head. But Christian VII didn't need weight to feel the pressure. It was already pressing down on him long before the coronation. He was 17, barely a man, already a monarch. They dressed him in furs and brocade and led him through a sea of bowed heads, as if pretending would make it true, that this pale, blinking boy was strong enough to rule. They called him divinely appointed. He repeated the words they gave him. But deep in his gut, something twisted. That twisting never left. At first, the signs were subtle. A refusal to meet the eyes of ambassadors, strange outbursts at court dinners, laughter that arrived half a beat too late. But it was dismissed, youthful eccentricity, nothing more. The court had seen mad kings before. They knew how to wait madness out, how to smile through the cracks. But Christian's cracks grew wider. He developed rituals, not the sacred kind, the private kind. He would wash his hands 15, 20 times a day, whisper to himself before speaking aloud, tap his left foot 3 times before entering a room. He was obsessed with symmetry. Candles on his table had to be perfectly aligned, or he would fly into a shaking panic. And then the hair. At first he pulled at it only when anxious. A twist of the fingers at his temple, a nervous tug. But it escalated. Soon there were clumps missing, behind the ears at the nape of his neck. Servants began finding strands on his pillows, in his teacups. He hid them in his pockets, chewed them behind his sleeve when he thought no one was watching. But someone was always watching. Whispers returned to the palace halls. The king had taken to muttering in Latin while staring at the floor. He had stopped recognizing old friends. He giggled when ministers read him reports of famine. Sometimes he wouldn't speak for hours. Other times he wouldn't stop speaking for days. And yet no one dared name it, not publicly, not officially. A king could not be mad, because if the king was mad, the entire order of things was at risk. So they called it fatigue, or melancholy, or spiritual unrest. They sent him to the countryside to recover, and for a few days he seemed calm. He fed birds, walked alone near the river, stared at the clouds like he could read their movements. But even there, madness crept after him, barefoot and silent. One night, a servant found him, crouched in the grass, whispering to the moon, hair falling from his mouth like strands of black silk. When asked what he was doing, Christian answered simply, "Keeping myself inside." The servant said nothing, and the next morning no one spoke of it again. Back at court, his decline became harder to mask. He began slapping himself during audiences, scratching his arms until they bled. He would interrupt meetings with nonsensical poetry or sudden fits of anger, accusing his advisers of poisoning him, of plotting his death, of replacing his mirror with a lyre. But what unnerved the court most wasn't his rage. It was his clarity, the moments in between. The stillness that fell just before he smiled and asked, "Do you see him too?" They didn't know who he meant, not yet. The mirror saw it first, the reflection that was no longer quite his own, a ghost behind the eyes, a shadow that mimicked his gestures just a little too slowly. Christian was losing the fight, but he was still king. And kings must have wives, so they chose one for him. A girl from England, young, pure, political. A queen to stand beside a broken boy with a crown on his head and hair in his mouth. She was beautiful, Caroline Matilda, 15 years old, blonde, composed, trained from birth to marry, someone she'd never love. When her carriage arrived in Copenhagen, she carried with her the hopeful ignorance of youth and a portrait of the boy king who would become her husband, a portrait that lied. On their wedding night, Christian was polite, detached. He spoke in clipped syllables, as if reciting a script. Then he left her alone in their chamber and spent the night pacing the palace corridors barefoot, whispering to the statues. The consummation came days later, and it was brief, silent. She never spoke of it again. At court she was treated with stiff reverence and cold hands. But it was Christian who alarmed her most, not because he was cruel, but because he was vanishing, slowly, thought by thought. She would find him staring at his reflection for hours, lips parted, unmoving. Sometimes he would approach her gently, only to suddenly recoil and murmur, "No, not you. You're still real." Other times he would weep in front of her, seemingly unaware she was even in the room. And then there was the hair. It started appearing in strange places, his boots, his ink jars, clinging to the hems of royal robes, long strands torn at the root, curled and saliva matted. The palace physician noticed raw patches blooming along the king's scalp and tried to intervene. Christian insisted it was part of the ritual. He refused to elaborate. He began eating in private, or not at all. At dinners, he would pick at his food, push it around, whispering under his breath between bites. Occasionally he would excuse himself and return with reddened eyes and a fresh wound on his forearm, hidden beneath lace cuffs. One morning, Caroline found a hairbrush in their chamber. The bristles were snapped, bent, and thick with dark strands that had clearly been torn out violently. There were bloody fingerprints on the handle. She showed no one. Instead, she asked the chambermaids to remove all the mirrors from her room, because when she looked into them, she swore she could see him behind her, watching, smiling with lips stained black. In public, the king still performed his role. He bowed to diplomats, he signed decrees, he kissed his wife's hand, but behind the mask, something feral had taken root, a gnawing compulsion that had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with power, only hunger and fear. He once told a servant that the strands tasted like memory, that chewing them helped him remember who he was, or maybe who he wasn't. And every night, Caroline would lie beside a man she barely knew, listening as he mumbled nonsense in his sleep, watching his hands twitch and claw at his scalp, even in dreams. The hair began to vanish from his head, but it never truly disappeared. It only moved deeper inside. He arrived like a balm, soft-voiced, well-dressed, unnervingly calm. Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician with enlightenment in his veins and ambition coiled like a knife beneath his ribs. He had been hired as the king's personal doctor, nothing more. But within weeks, it was clear he had touched something no one else could. Christian listened to him, not always, not fully, but more than he listened to the courtiers or priests or terrified ministers who tiptoed through every interaction. Struensee didn't tiptoe. He walked into the royal chamber, looked madness in the eyes and said, "You're not broken, you're misunderstood." And Christian, desperate for any voice louder than the ones in his head, believed him. So the king let the doctor in. Struensee began small, daily walks, long talks. He coaxed Christian into writing down his thoughts, however fragmented. He encouraged music, fresh air, routines. For a brief moment, the fog seemed to lift. Christian even smiled again, awkwardly, yes, but without the usual vacancy behind his teeth. The court sighed in relief, but what they didn't see, what they refused to see, was how rapidly Struensee was building something behind the curtains. It wasn't healing, it was control, but something was beginning. Because once he had the king's trust, Struensee began whispering suggestions, subtle at first, a change in court schedule, a new face on the council, then bolder, royal decrees written in Struensee's own hand, signed by a king who barely read them. They said Christian was improving, but no one could tell what part of him remained. He had become smooth, polished, empty in a different way. He still twitched, still plucked hairs, still stared too long at shadows. But now he did it in silence, with perfect posture, his hands neatly folded in his lap. They dressed him better, sat him on thrones again, told the world the madness had passed. But beneath the velvet robes, he had stopped speaking in his own words. It was Struensee who gave him language now. Caroline saw it first. She watched her husband nod through cabinet meetings like a puppet in a borrowed suit. When he did speak, it was with phrases the doctor had used days earlier. She noticed how Struensee was always nearby, just behind the curtain, just outside the room, just close enough to correct the performance. And when she spoke with Struensee, she was struck by how he looked at her, not with courtly distance, but with something electric. He was handsome, brilliant, confident in ways Christian never was, and he was always watching. The king, now more doll than man, would chew his fingers raw in the evenings, while Caroline and Struensee exchanged glances across the candlelit hall. Nothing had happened yet, not truly. A new trinity was forming in the palace, a broken king, a brilliant puppet master, and a queen with eyes too sharp to pretend she didn't see. And behind it all, Christian's reflection stared back from the mirror, silent, shivering, hairless in patches, not quite gone, but no longer whole. It began with a shared glance, then a silence too long to be innocent. Caroline Matilda was not naive. She had spent her childhood learning how to sit perfectly still, how to smile when ignored, how to endure a marriage that wasn't a marriage. She had been a queen since she was 15, and a ghost since the moment Christian first looked through her. But Struensee, he looked at her. It was subtle at first. He lingered in doorways. He spoke to her in complete sentences. He didn't speak to her like a queen. He spoke to her like a woman who had gone too long without being seen. And when he touched her, when he handed her a letter, when he helped her into a carriage, his fingers stayed for just a second too long. She should have pulled away. Instead, She leaned closer. What bloomed between them wasn't just lust, it was a shared understanding. They were both trapped in a palace of pretense, orbiting a king who no longer ruled, who no longer knew whether he was a man, a myth, or a mannequin with a crown. Christian didn't notice, or perhaps he did, in some sunken, unreachable part of himself, but by then he had stopped responding to most things. He would stand at the windows for hours, watching his own reflection in the glass instead of the city beyond it. He plucked out what little hair remained, strand by strand, folding each one into pages of books he no longer read. Servants once found a drawer filled with locks, some chewed, others braided. A catalogue of self-destruction. He began speaking to things that weren't there, people long dead, versions of himself that might never have existed. Once he insisted on holding a dinner for the other Christian, and became violent when no one set a place for him. The court knew the truth by now. This was no melancholia, no eccentric phase. Their king had hollowed out, and something else, something quieter and far more unsettling, was wearing his skin. But outwardly, the fiction continued. Caroline and Struensee became closer. Letters passed between hands beneath silver trays, smiles exchanged behind lace fans. One night, lightning struck the palace gardens, and the queen was seen running barefoot through the corridors, drenched and laughing, with Struensee at her heels. The courtiers pretended not to see, but the walls had eyes, and the walls remembered. Their affair deepened. It wasn't secret, not really. The staff knew, the council suspected. Even the king's mother, a cold-eyed matriarch with a voice like a blade, began preparing for the storm. But Caroline didn't care, or perhaps she cared too much, because for the first time since arriving in Denmark, she felt alive. Not managed, not displayed, not wrapped in protocol and silence. With Struensee, she wasn't just a queen. She was a woman reclaiming her body, her breath, her will. But Christian, the boy king, still sat alone. In the evenings, he would crawl beneath the palace tables and murmur to the wood. When servants tried to coax him out, he whispered, "She's gone." But I remember the way she laughed. They assumed he meant Caroline. He didn't. He meant the girl in the mirror, the one who vanished when the voices grew too loud, the one who smiled at him before his first strand turned to ash on his tongue. The ghost was still there, watching. But soon the walls would speak, and when they did, the price of love would be blood. The body keeps the secrets the mind can no longer hold. By the summer of 1771, Christian's body was no longer his own. It had become a map of damage, traced in tremors and scabs. His hair, once golden and soft like a boy's first crown, had vanished in ragged clumps. His scalp was raw, inflamed, his fingernails blackened from constant chewing. There were patches on his arms where the skin had been rubbed red from hours of scratching. And he had grown thin, hauntingly so, as if whatever fed on him from within had begun to win. He refused to eat some days, afraid the food was laced with poison. Other days he ate ravenously, only to vomit moments later, convinced it wasn't his hunger but someone else's. Someone hiding in his chest, whispering what to do. The court tried to manage him behind drawn curtains. They created elaborate lies for foreign ambassadors. A mild fever, they'd say, or temporary exhaustion from spiritual contemplation. But the walls knew. The walls had always known. He would rock back and forth on the floor, clutching his knees and reciting nonsense poetry about mirrors and mouths. He said his teeth were falling out even when they weren't. He said the blood in his veins belonged to someone else, and he needed to bite his wrists to let them go. Once, They found him trying to cut his shadow from the wall with a butter knife. "He keeps watching," he whispered. "He wants my eyes." Struensee still wrote the laws, still managed the kingdom, but his own eyes had begun to falter. The man who once strode through the palace with confidence now looked over his shoulder. He saw enemies in every hallway, poison in every cup. He loved the queen. God, he loved her. But even she had begun to seem like a mirror, reflecting back a future he couldn't control. Caroline, radiant and reckless, believed they were building something new, a modern monarchy, a softer world. She didn't see the cracks in Struensee's armor, the fraying nerve beneath the intellect. Or maybe she did and chose not to care. After all, they had each other. Wasn't that enough? It wasn't. Christian grew worse. He began tearing at his clothes during council meetings, screaming without words, trying to crawl beneath the carpets because the floorboards were whispering truths about his birth. They said he was never real, that he had been stitched together from scraps of royal flesh, animated by duty and filled with rot. He believed them. The palace physician tried to sedate him, but Christian spat the medicine into the doctor's face. He howled until his throat bled. The next morning they found him curled in the corner of his chamber, asleep on a bed of shredded royal decrees, his mouth full of chewed paper. Later, when asked why he did it, he replied, "The laws taste like her hair." No one asked who her was. They already knew. This wasn't illness. This was consumption. The soul turning on the flesh, the crown eating the mind. And it wasn't just the king who was unraveling. His body was merely the first to confess what the palace had long denied. They had built a kingdom atop a boy who was never meant to rule, who had never wanted the gold, only the quiet. And now the quiet had come. But it sounded like screaming. It began in whispers, in corners, in the rustle of silk behind locked doors. The court had tolerated Struensee because he kept the king from unraveling completely, because he wrote laws with clean hands and Enlightenment logic, even if his soul was soaked in ambition, because for a time the kingdom functioned, barely, under his paper-thin control. But Caroline's belly had started to swell. There was no denying it now. The queen was pregnant. The king hadn't touched her in over a year. And yet, she glowed. It was an open secret and a quiet scandal. The lovers had crossed the final line. And for those waiting in the shadows, it was the moment they'd been praying for. The Dowager Queen Juliana, the king's stepmother, cold as polished stone, moved first. She had been watching, always watching. And now, with half the nobility whispering treason, she knew the palace was ripe for rupture. She summoned allies in the dead of night, conservative ministers, old aristocrats, jealous courtiers who had watched Struensee rise too far too fast. They gathered in silent rooms by candlelight and planned the unmaking of a kingdom. They didn't need soldiers. They needed silence. They forged a royal decree in Christian's name, easily done. He no longer knew what he was signing. They wrote it in elegant ink and folded it with reverence, as if it weren't soaked in betrayal. On the cold dawn of January 17th, 1772, they struck. Guards stormed the Queen's chambers first. Caroline was still in bed, tangled in linen and dreams. She screamed when they dragged her out, barefoot and weeping, the child inside her just beginning to stir. They took her through servant corridors, so no one would see a queen crying like a girl. Then they came for Struensee. He didn't resist. He'd known this was coming, perhaps for weeks. He folded his hands behind his back and let them bind him like a criminal. When they asked if he had anything to say, he simply said, "Be kind to her." They weren't. Christian was told later that day, though he wouldn't remember. They handed him the same paper he had unknowingly signed. He stared at it blankly, then whispered, "Will she still sit beside me at dinner?" They didn't answer. The coup was bloodless, on the surface. No battles, no riots. Just a reshuffling of names and the quiet burial of affection. But beneath the silence was a violence far more brutal. Because what they'd destroyed wasn't just a relationship. They'd severed the last thread, tethering the king to reality. They dressed him carefully, like a child for his portrait. Layers of royal velvet, buttons polished to gleam, a crown adjusted just so. The ministers called him Majesty, with a reverence that rang hollow, and Christian nodded with a smile that no longer reached his eyes. But inside, there was nothing left to polish. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't walk unless guided. When seated, he often froze mid-breath, as if unsure what posture a king should assume. The body remained upright, but the soul inside had folded itself small. The boy who once chewed his hair in corners now sat perfectly still for hours, like a wax figure on a throne. They called it recovery. They said the madness had passed, but this wasn't recovery. This was erasure. They kept him in a palace within a palace. Quiet servants, short conversations, paintings removed from the walls because he said the eyes followed him. He no longer asked for Caroline. When her name was mentioned, he smiled faintly, as though recalling a dream he no longer believed had ever been real. At dinners, he mimicked the nobles beside him, raised his glass when they did, laughed when others laughed, but always a beat behind, and always with that look, like a man watching his own life from across the room. When visitors came, they were shown the doll king. He would be waiting, hands folded, hair thin and neatly combed, lips curled into something like serenity. "Yes," he would say, "the kingdom is well." But once, a visiting ambassador caught him muttering under his breath. He leaned in to listen, and the words chilled his blood. "I am not here. I am behind the mirror." They said it was a joke, that Christian had always had a strange sense of humor. But after that, the ambassador cut his visit short. Behind palace walls, Caroline awaited trial in a separate chamber. Struensee sat in chains, scribbling letters he knew would never be sent, and Christian sat, obedient, beautiful, hollow, a man-shaped marionette, dressed in dignity and fed on routine. They had built their perfect king, one who ruled nothing, not even himself. He did not die with a scream. He died with a whisper, so quiet, even history almost missed it. After the executions, after the exile, after the final goodbye to Caroline Matilda, who was shipped off like a forgotten letter and never saw her children again, Christian stayed, and the throne stayed with him, clutching, consuming. They left him in the castle of Rendsburg, far from the royal court, far from mirrors that might remember who he used to be. Years passed. The ministers ruled in his name, but no one spoke his name aloud anymore. He became a legal fiction, a signature without a soul behind it. Some days he wandered the gardens in silence, shadowed by guards who never looked him in the eye. He spoke to birds, to rocks, to the fog, and sometimes he'd sit for hours, staring at the ground as if listening to something deep beneath the soil. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "I'm waiting for my hair to grow back, so I can return to the palace." But the hair never grew. The throne never called. And so he sat, year after year, not king, not prisoner, something in between, something unfinished. By the end, his skin was paper. His hands trembled like autumn leaves, and his eyes, the eyes that once gleamed with childish hope, then madness, Then nothing became dull glass. He was still breathing, but only just, as though every inhale was an apology for still existing. He died on March 13th, 1808, not in battle, not in ceremony, but alone in a cold room, attended only by silence. No coronation song, no mourning parade, just the quiet crumple of a life folded inward too many times. They buried him as a king, but the throne had already devoured him long ago.